I still remember the exact second it happened, because something in my chest went quiet. We were standing in my father's office, surrounded by framed photos of family success, when I finally asked the question I'd been carrying for months. Why were my siblings being paid more than me, when I was doing more work? He didn't hesitate. He leaned back, folded his arms, and said it like it was common sense. They need it more than you. Then he smiled, almost proud. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. And in that moment, I stopped being an employee, and started planning my exit. From the outside, our family business looked like one of those success stories people love to quote. Built from nothing, passed down with pride, held together by the idea that family comes first. My father loved saying that. Clients believed it. Employees repeated it. And for a long time, I believed it too. Working there didn't feel like a job at first, it felt like a responsibility, something you did because your name was on the door and your blood was in the walls. We didn't talk about favoritism. We talked about sacrifice. Late nights weren't overtime, they were helping the family. Missed weekends weren't a loss, they were an investment. And whenever something felt unfair, there was always the same answer: it'll balance out in the end. That phrase covered everything, like a blanket pulled over problems nobody wanted to look at too closely. My father ran the company with a mix of charm and control. He liked to remind everyone how much he'd given up to build it, how lucky we were to be part of it. Gratitude was expected, not earned. Questioning anything felt like questioning him, and nobody wanted to be seen as ungrateful, especially not in front of family. To outsiders, we were equals. Same last name. Same titles on paper. Same smiles in group photos. But fairness, I later learned, doesn't announce when it's missing. It hides behind tradition and loyalty, behind phrases like "this is how we've always done it." And back then, I didn't realize I was slowly accepting a system that only worked as long as I never asked how much I was actually worth. On paper, our positions looked similar enough that no one questioned them. Same department, overlapping titles, shared responsibility. But in practice, the lines were very clear, just never spoken out loud. I handled the work that kept the business running when no one was watching. The things that didn't look impressive in meetings but caused real damage if they weren't done right. Deadlines, problem clients, last-minute fixes. When something broke, it landed on my desk. My siblings' roles were lighter, cleaner, easier to explain. They worked regular hours. They picked projects they liked. If something went wrong, it was a learning experience. If something went right, it was proof of their talent. They were visible. I was dependable. And in our company, those two things were not rewarded the same way. I was the one my father called when a client was furious or a contract was about to fall apart. I was the one who stayed late to make sure payroll went through, that vendors got paid, that systems didn't crash overnight. No applause followed those moments. Just relief that the problem had quietly disappeared. And once it did, so did the credit. At family dinners, the conversation always drifted toward their accomplishments. A deal they helped with. A presentation they gave. A connection they made. When someone asked what I was working on, my father would wave it off. They just handle the back end, he'd say, like that meant it mattered less. Like stability was invisible by default. I told myself it was temporary. That hard work would speak for itself. That being reliable would eventually turn into being respected. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I wasn't being prepared for something bigger. I was being positioned to hold everything together while everyone else climbed. And the more I proved I could carry the weight, the heavier it became, without any sign that my role was ever meant to change. The warning signs didn't show up all at once. They slipped in quietly, disguised as normal business decisions, small enough that I could explain them away if I tried hard enough. A raise that was delayed until next quarter. A bonus that somehow skipped me but landed on someone else's desk. Each time I noticed, I told myself there was a reasonable explanation I just wasn't seeing yet. Whenever I asked questions, the answers were vague but confident. You're in a different phase. Your time is coming. You don't need to worry about money the way they do. Those phrases sounded supportive on the surface, but they always ended the conversation. Pushing further felt like being difficult, like breaking some unspoken rule about trust and loyalty. What really should have warned me was how often I was asked to just help out, without anything changing afterward. I trained my siblings on systems I built. I fixed mistakes I didn't make. I stepped in when deadlines were missed, then watched someone else take the credit when things finally went right. Every time, I swallowed the frustration because that's what reliable people do. There were moments I almost said something. Late nights alone in the office. Long drives home where I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if I was being naive or just afraid. But each time, I chose the safer story, that family wouldn't intentionally take advantage of me, that my father wouldn't let things be unfair if he truly saw the full picture. Looking back, that was the real red flag. Not the pay, not the workload, not even the excuses. It was how much effort it took to keep convincing myself that nothing was wrong, when deep down, I already knew something was that I didn't find out on purpose. That's the part that still gets me. I wasn't digging, wasn't snooping, wasn't trying to catch anyone in a lie. I was doing exactly what I always did, covering a task that needed to be handled quickly. Payroll had an issue that morning, and my father asked me to check the numbers before they went out. It was routine. Or at least, it was supposed to be. As I scrolled through the file, something didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was a formatting error. Then I thought maybe I was reading the wrong column. I double-checked the names. Mine. Then my siblings. I refreshed the sheet. The numbers didn't change. Their salaries were higher. Not by a small margin, not by a rounding error. Significantly higher. The kind of difference you can't explain away with experience or performance. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. I actually felt embarrassed, like I was misunderstanding something obvious and making a big deal out of nothing. I sat there longer than I should have, staring at the screen, hoping my brain would rearrange the information into something that made sense. It didn't. Then the questions started flooding in. Had this always been the case? How long had I been earning less? Did they know? Did my father know? The longer I sat with it, the heavier it felt. Every late night. Every emergency call. Every time I was told I was essential. All of it replayed in my head with a new, bitter context. What hurt most wasn't just the money. It was what the money represented. Pay is a statement, whether people admit it or not. It's how a company tells you what you're worth. And in that moment, staring at those numbers, I realized the business I'd poured myself into had been speaking very clearly. I just hadn't wanted to listen. I closed the file and sent it off like nothing was wrong. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight. Because once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. And I knew, deep down, that this discovery wasn't the problem. It was the beginning of one that I didn't confront him right away. I needed time to cool off, to make sure I wasn't walking in fueled by emotion instead of facts. By the time I stepped into his office later that afternoon, I was calm, almost too calm. I told myself this was a simple conversation. A misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a few honest words. I started carefully. I explained what I'd seen, made it clear I wasn't accusing anyone of anything. I even gave him an out, suggesting there might be a reason I didn't understand yet. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, there was a pause. Long enough to make my stomach tighten. Then he sighed, like I'd just asked something inconvenient. He said compensation was complicated. That roles weren't always measured by hours or effort. That everyone contributed in different ways. His voice was calm, practiced, like this was a conversation he'd had before, just not with me. I pushed a little. I pointed out the responsibilities I carried, the things I handled alone. I reminded him that when something went wrong, it was my phone that rang. I wasn't asking for praise. I was asking for fairness. That's when his tone shifted, just slightly. Less explanatory. More final. He told me I should be proud to support the family. That my siblings had different needs, different priorities. He said I was more stable, more independent, as if those traits disqualified me from being treated equally. The words landed harder than I expected, each one quietly stripping away an excuse I'd been holding on to. I watched him talk and realized something unsettling. This wasn't new information to him. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't reconsidering anything. He was justifying a system he believed in. And as he spoke, I felt the last bit of doubt I had dissolve. This wasn't about numbers on a spreadsheet. It was about how he saw us, and where I fit in that picture. By the time I left his office, my hands were still steady. But the conversation had done something irreversible. It had taken a private suspicion and turned it into a confirmed truth. And there was no going back from that. I thought the worst part of the conversation was already over. I was wrong. Just as I stood up to leave, my father said it, casually, like he was offering advice instead of delivering a verdict. He told me it made sense that my siblings earned more because they had families to support, bigger expenses, more pressure. Then he added the line that changed everything: you don't really need the money the way they do. The room went quiet, even though nothing around us had changed. That sentence hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. In one breath, he erased my effort, my time, and my value. It wasn't about performance. It wasn't about contribution. It was about his personal judgment of who deserved more, and I didn't make the cut. I wanted to argue. I wanted to list everything I'd done, every crisis I'd handled, every sacrifice I'd made without complaint. But I didn't. Because something clicked in that moment. If he could say that so easily, it meant this decision wasn't temporary. It was permanent. Logical, in his mind. Justified. I realized then that no amount of proof would change it. I could work harder, stay later, give more, and it would only confirm what he already believed. That I was the dependable one. The one who could take less and still keep going. The one who wouldn't make things uncomfortable by demanding more. The betrayal didn't come with shouting or anger. It came wrapped in reason. And that's what made it hurt the most. He truly believed he was being fair. And standing there, listening to him explain why I mattered less, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't a conversation I needed to win. It was a situation I needed to leave. What stayed with me after that conversation wasn't just what my father said, it was what everyone else didn't. My siblings were nearby. They knew we'd talked. They knew something serious had come up. But no one came to ask how it went. No one checked in. No one even looked uncomfortable enough to pretend they cared. At dinner that night, the atmosphere felt carefully normal. Conversations flowed around safe topics, jokes were made, plates were passed. I watched my siblings laugh and talk like nothing had shifted, like the ground beneath me hadn't just cracked open. When our eyes met, they looked away. Not out of guilt, out of avoidance. Silence is easier when it protects your position. I realized then that they knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. They had accepted the benefits without questioning the cost to me. And in doing so, they'd made their choice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was quiet, and that somehow made it worse. No one defended me. No one said it was unfair. No one suggested we fix it together. And I understood why. Speaking up would mean risking their advantage. It would mean challenging my father. It would mean admitting the system only worked because I absorbed the imbalance. That night, I felt more alone than I had in years. Not because I was isolated, but because I was surrounded by people who had decided my discomfort was acceptable. Their silence wasn't neutral. It was agreement. And standing there, listening to the clink of silverware and the hum of small talk, I finally stopped wondering where I stood. I wasn't part of a team. I was a convenience. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was angry, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying everything I'd ignored for years. The conversations. The excuses. The way I'd been taught to be grateful instead of fairly treated. Lying there in the dark, I realized how carefully I'd been trained to confuse loyalty with self-sacrifice. I opened my laptop and stared at my workload, the endless list of things only I handled. Files labeled with my initials. Systems no one else fully understood. Problems scheduled to land on my desk the next morning like they always did. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided: what happens if I'm not there? The answer scared me, and then, strangely, it didn't. I realized how much of the business depended on my silence, my availability, my willingness to clean up messes without acknowledgement. I wasn't indispensable because I was valued. I was indispensable because it was convenient for me to be. I thought about staying. About accepting less pay in exchange for stability, family approval, and the comfort of familiarity. I knew exactly what that future looked like. More responsibility. More justification. More reminders of why I shouldn't expect more. The idea felt heavy, like slowly agreeing to disappear. Then I imagined leaving. The fear hit immediately: financial uncertainty, fractured relationships, the label of being difficult. But underneath that fear was something else. Relief. The quiet possibility of choosing myself without needing permission. By the time the sky began to lighten, my decision was already made. I didn't feel dramatic or brave. I felt clear. For the first time in a long while, the path in front of me wasn't shaped by what others needed from me, it was shaped by what I refused to accept anymore. And once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. I didn't announce my decision right away. I went into work the next morning like everything was normal. Same routine. Same calm. I answered emails, handled a few urgent issues, and finished the tasks I knew would be difficult for anyone else to step into. Not out of obligation, but because I wanted to leave nothing unclear. When I finally asked my father for a moment, he looked mildly annoyed, like I was interrupting something more important. I told him I'd made a decision. I kept my voice steady as I said I was resigning. No accusations. No speeches. Just the facts. The room felt smaller as the words settled between us. He laughed, just a little. Not cruelly, dismissively. He told me I was overreacting, that I'd cool off in a few days. He said quitting would be a mistake, that I didn't fully understand the consequences. In his mind, this was a phase, not a boundary. I explained that I'd already thought it through. That I wasn't asking for a counteroffer or a compromise. His expression shifted then, from amused to irritated. He reminded me of everything the company had done for me. Of the risks he'd taken. Of the loyalty I owed him. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I repeated myself. I was done. I gave notice, outlined a brief transition, and told him when my last day would be. The finality in my tone landed harder than the words themselves. As I stood to leave, I saw it in his eyes. Not fear, not regret, just certainty that I'd be back. He believed the business, the family, the pressure would pull me into line. He didn't realize I'd already stepped out of it. The first day after I left was quiet. Almost suspiciously quiet. No calls. No messages. I imagined them adjusting, redistributing my tasks, convincing themselves it wouldn't be that hard. I pictured my father confidently explaining that everything was under control. And for a moment, I wondered if I'd overestimated my impact. That feeling didn't last. By the second day, deadlines started slipping. Not in dramatic ways, just enough to cause friction. A client asked a question no one could answer immediately. A report went out late. A small issue turned into a long meeting because no one knew where to find the information I used to keep in my head. By the end of the week, the cracks were impossible to hide. Systems I'd maintained quietly began to fail without constant oversight. Tasks I'd bundled together and handled instinctively were now spread across multiple people, each assuming someone else was responsible. Nothing catastrophic happened, but everything slowed down. And in business, slow is expensive. My father started showing up earlier and leaving later. Meetings ran longer. Voices got sharper. I heard through a former coworker that they were reevaluating processes, which was just a polite way of saying they didn't know how I'd been holding everything together. What surprised me most wasn't the chaos, it was the realization that none of it was personal. They weren't struggling because they missed me. They were struggling because they'd relied on what I provided without ever acknowledging it. The stability I brought had been invisible until it was gone. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt calm. Every small disruption confirmed what I already knew, that my role had never been properly understood or respected. It had simply been absorbed. And as the business worked harder and harder to replace what I'd given for free, I finally understood the truth. Leaving hadn't broken anything. It had only revealed what was already fragile. The first call came 3 days after my last day. I recognized the number immediately and let it ring. When the voicemail notification popped up, I didn't listen to it. I already knew the tone, calm, professional, confident. The kind of call that assumes cooperation. The second call came the next morning. This time there was a text. Short. Polite. Can you call me when you have a moment? No apology. No urgency. Just the expectation that I'd be available, the way I always had been. By the third call, the tone changed. The message was longer, less composed. My father mentioned specific issues. Deadlines. Confusion. He said they just needed a little guidance, a quick walkthrough. He framed it like a favor, like nothing fundamental had shifted. I stared at my phone for a long time before setting it face down. Ignoring those calls felt heavier than answering them. Not because I owed anything, but because I knew exactly how that conversation would go. It would start with urgency and end with things going back to normal. Each unanswered call was a boundary I'd never held before. And with each one, something strange happened. The guilt I expected didn't grow, it faded. In its place was clarity. I wasn't being cruel. I was being consistent. The final message came late in the evening. No pretense this time. Just stress leaking through carefully chosen words. For the first time, he sounded unsure. I didn't respond. Because if I did, even once, I knew I'd be right back where I started, fixing problems created by people who never planned to fix how they treated me. And I was done proving my value to people who only noticed it when it was gone, that I didn't witness my father's realization firsthand. I heard about it in fragments, passed along by people who had no reason to protect his pride anymore. Meetings that ended in silence. Conversations where his confidence cracked just enough for panic to slip through. The tone in the office had changed, and everyone could feel it. He started asking questions he'd never needed to ask before. Simple ones. Where is this file kept? Who normally handles this? Why does this take so long now? Each question was a small admission that he didn't actually understand how much depended on me. Not because he hadn't been told, but because he'd never bothered to listen. At some point, it stopped being about logistics. It became personal. He began defending his past decisions out loud, explaining them to people who hadn't asked. That's usually how you can tell someone knows they were wrong. They're not trying to convince others, they're trying to convince themselves. What hurt wasn't that he finally saw my value. It was that it took my absence for him to see it. Years of consistency, loyalty, and effort hadn't been enough. But inconvenience. That got his attention immediately. I heard he said my name differently now. With frustration. With regret. With the kind of respect that only shows up after it's too late to use it properly. He talked about bringing me back, about fixing things, about how he never meant it to turn out this way. But realization doesn't undo damage. And understanding someone's worth after they've walked away doesn't restore what was broken. It just confirms why they had to leave in the first place. People assumed the hardest part would be saying no. It wasn't. The hardest part was accepting that going back would undo everything I'd finally protected. By the time my father reached out directly, the offer was already better than before. More money. More flexibility. More recognition. All the things I'd been told weren't possible. But I didn't hesitate. Because the problem was never the compensation. It was the condition attached to it. Going back would mean pretending the original reasoning hadn't existed. That the imbalance hadn't been justified. That respect could be retroactively applied without accountability. I thought about what returning would teach everyone involved. That mistreatment is negotiable. That silence eventually pays off. That boundaries are temporary as long as pressure is applied long enough. I wasn't willing to reinforce that lesson, not to them, and not to myself. There was also the quiet truth I couldn't ignore anymore. I'd changed. Stepping away had shown me how much energy I'd spent shrinking myself to keep peace. How often I'd accepted less to avoid being labeled difficult. Going back would mean becoming that version of myself again. I wished them well. Genuinely. I didn't threaten, didn't lecture, didn't demand an apology. I simply declined. And for the first time, my decision wasn't debated or dismissed. It was accepted, because there was nothing left to bargain with. Walking away didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel aligned. I wasn't proving a point or teaching a lesson. I was honoring a boundary I should have set years earlier. And that was worth more than any offer they could make. It took time for everything to settle. Not just the situation, but the emotions tied to it. When the noise faded, what surprised me most was how light I felt. Not relieved in a dramatic way, just steady. Like I'd finally stopped carrying something that was never meant to be mine alone. I realized I hadn't left because of money. I left because of the story I was being asked to accept about myself. That my work mattered less. That my needs were optional. That fairness was something I had to earn by staying quiet. Walking away was the first time I rejected that story completely. What I learned is this: people don't always mistreat you out of malice. Sometimes they do it out of comfort. They get used to what you provide and forget there's a person attached to it. And the longer you tolerate it, the more normal it feels, to them. Leaving didn't make me bitter. It made me honest. Honest about what I deserve. Honest about what I will and won't accept. And honest about the fact that respect delayed until it's inconvenient isn't respect at all. If you're watching this and you feel stuck in a situation where your effort is expected but your value is debated, I want you to hear this clearly: being patient doesn't mean being invisible. And loyalty should never require you to disappear. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to argue, prove, or explain. It's to step away and let people feel the weight of what they dismissed. So I'll ask you the same question I finally asked myself, one that changed everything. If you stopped showing up tomorrow, would they miss you? Or would they only miss what you made easier for them?